Ernestito always said, "Why do people have to be so divided?" And I would reply, "Well, because that's the way the world is. But we're all born and we all die. Then why the difference? Why do you have to earn 20 pesos when others earn 100? That's wickedness." He was a grown-up boy who made you think.
The influences of Ernesto's diverse family life now even affected his leisure time. His daredevil pranks began to take on an even more sophisticated turn as he and his friends drifted around Altagracia. Even his games were becoming politicized.
They would pretend to be fascists and Republicans in some of their games. They would also take stands on local issues of politics. In one case, when he was about 10, the power company rose the rates, and he and his band went around in a vandalistic or juvenile protest, knocking out all of the streetlights with their slingshots.
In his early teens, Ernesto traveled 30 miles by bus to high school in the provincial capital of Córdoba. Here he met new friends and took up new sports. Despite his short stature and his illness, his characteristic determination to succeed triumphed. He had to pass an initiation test for the rugby team, which involved hurling himself over a horizontal broomstick.
The boy put his shirt and shoulder pads on and he jumped once, twice, 3 times. If I hadn't stopped him, he would have made a hole in the yard. That was the first glimpse I had of his tenacity, which is one of the things he carried throughout his life, his great tenacity.
Soon family matters would catapult Ernesto Guevara into another great upheaval. Before they did, he learned a useful skill for the future. In March 1947, the Guevara family moved to Buenos Aires, leaving Altagracia and the mountains behind. The move followed another financial disaster and the breakdown of Ernesto's parents' marriage. Celia would no longer put up with her husband's infidelities. Ernesto's father was banished to the couch, surrounded by noisy, chaotic family life. The neighborhood in which the Guevaras now lived was respectably middle class. Their behavior was seen as a little eccentric. That of Ernesto, now 18, was becoming more than eccentric.
The young Guevara was quite an iconoclast. He liked to stand out, and by his late teens, he had acquired the nickname given to him by his friends, and one he loved, called the chancho, or the pig. He wore a nylon windbreaker, which he never washed, and he claimed his trousers could stand up on their own. He actually liked the attention it gave him, and it was something that all of his friends spoke about and remembered him for.
Ernesto had intended to become an engineer, but the death of his beloved grandmother from a stroke and his own desire to find a cure for asthma made him decide to become a doctor. In May 1947, he enrolled as a medical student at the University of Buenos Aires. But Ernesto Guevara had also developed a great wanderlust. The restlessness of his childhood continued, although now alone. He fitted his bicycle with a small engine, and during his holidays set out on a trip to explore Argentina. The Argentina he didn't yet know, a world new to him. The trip made deep impressions. Ernesto poured into his notebooks the thoughts and political ideas which were increasingly occupying his mind.
He came away from that trip extremely reflective about what he had seen, and beginning to wonder about the politics of life. You can see the stirrings of something new in him. He clearly had a philosophical bent, and he was interested in discerning some of the answers to the world's problems. And he filled his notebook with reveries on what he saw around him, the contrast between rich and poor.
Something, though, nearly put a stop to Ernesto's bicycling and hitchhiking trips. He fell in love. Maria del Carmen Ferreira, Chichina, was the daughter of a wealthy family. But Ernesto's iconoclasm and scruffiness didn't endear him to them. Neither did his radical beliefs and odd journeys.
Era muy romántico, los dos, pero era muy romántico pensar que...
It was very romantic. They were both very romantic, but it was too romantic to think that she, who came from the upper class, not from the middle class, like Ernesto, would put up with his going off on a motorbike to wander around Latin America.
Para recorrer América Latina.
There was little prospect of marriage to his beloved, and so in January 1952, Ernesto, with his rugby-playing doctor friend Alberto Granado, set off once again on another trip. The journey took in much of the South American continent, but early on the motorbike gave up the ghost, and the pair continued their trip by various means of transport, even stowing away on a ship. The expedition again brought Ernesto into contact with the poor. He began to associate their plight with the social injustices imposed by the economic imperialism of the United States. He began a lifelong hate-hate relationship with Uncle Sam. The social consciences of the doctor and the medical student took them to a leper colony in Peru. Ernesto's stubborn frankness was exposed when pressed to give an opinion about a mediocre book written by a leprosy expert.
Yo con una rabia terrible.
I was very angry, and I said, Ernesto, aren't you ashamed of yourself? He gave us all the money to go to the leper colony in San Pablo. He killed our hunger all this time. Do you really have to rub the only negative thing about him in his face? So he looked at me with his typical expression and said, didn't you see that I didn't really want to say anything so as not to offend him? But if he was to speak, he had to tell the truth. That's something he did throughout his life.
When they left the colony, the lepers built them a raft, the Mambo Tango, to continue their journey down the Amazon.
The lepers formed a band and played music for them. And as they pushed out into the Amazon, Ernesto wrote home to his mother describing this really ghastly but rather lyrical scene of the violinist who had no fingers and the accordionist with no nose playing by this eerie lantern light at the edge of the Amazon, and was obviously very touched by this kind of contact.
The plight of the people he had met confirmed Ernesto's politicization. He wrote in his journal, "I am not the same as I was before."
During that trip to San Pablo, Che made the step from Ernesto to Che, from a doctor of the sick to a doctor of society.
Although Ernesto returned to Buenos Aires finally to qualify as a doctor, he soon set off on yet another trip. His mind was no longer on medical practice. Guatemala was a turning point. Here he found a political cause to support in the leftist regime of President Arbenz. Among the regime's other supporters, he met his first wife, Hilda, a Peruvian. Ernesto was disparaging of Hilda's looks, but attracted to her similar political and philosophical beliefs. Almost as soon as he'd found his political cause, it was smashed. A CIA-inspired coup overthrew the Arbenz government, which was too weak to defend itself. The downfall of the regime had a crucial effect on Ernesto's thinking and future actions.
Seeing it all fall apart convinced him that socialism was the antidote, the only way to confront and overthrow the system was through armed and very radical armed revolution. And he left Guatemala very much having decided that this was his route in life. And above all, he wanted to forge himself and his new identity in arms.
Ernesto the rebel was left without a cause. He needed a new one, and it lay elsewhere. Cuba was being run by the corrupt and repressive Fulgencio Batista. Americans and other foreigners poured into Havana, a city overflowing with delights forbidden back home. American money and influence dominated the country.